Hello, everyone. I'm Trevor Hedberg, Assistant Professor of Practice here at the University of Arizona. This semester, I've been teaching environmental ethics, and I've been using a textbook written by John Nolt called Environmental Ethics for the Long Term, an introduction. There's a link to where you can buy the textbook in the description if you're interested or have never heard of it. Given that textbook was published a while ago, I was really curious what current author of the textbook, John Nolt, might have to say some of the recent developments in environmental ethics. And so he's been gracious enough to join me today, taking some time out of a Saturday of all things, to talk about his textbook, what motivated him to write it, some of his views, and how his approach to environmental ethics may have changed in light of developments in the field over the last 8 to 10 years. So John is a professor emeritus at the University of Tennessee. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Trevor.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. So I thought to start, could you just say a little bit about what your career was like at the University of Tennessee before you retired? What got you into environmental ethics, that sort of thing?
Well, it was a long career. I was at the University of Tennessee for 44 years. I just last spring retired completely, although I'd spent the last 4 years before that just teaching rather than doing anything else. All the administrative stuff and the committee work I was done with, which was wonderful. I came to UT in 1978. I had a dissertation from Ohio State in set theory and mathematical logic. And interestingly, I was hired by UT not to teach logic, which was the main thing that I cared about, but aesthetics, which was sort of a sidelight for me. The way that happened was at Ohio State, I was pretty much focused on logic and nothing else. We had a placement director there who called the graduate students together and said, look, you guys can't just do one thing. You got to diversify. Otherwise, you'll never get a job. So I thought, well, I like art. I'll take some aesthetics courses. So I took a couple of aesthetics courses and listed aesthetics as a competence on my Vita, my CV. And lo and behold, the first year I was out on the market, I got some interviews, but it came to the end of the big meeting, the national meeting, American Philosophical Association. There was I'd gotten no offers, and all of a sudden somebody appeared from the University of Tennessee over at the table where a bunch of us from Ohio State were sitting and drinking. I'd had about 3 beers, and she asked me to come over to the Tennessee table and talk to them. And they wanted to talk about aesthetics since they knew I had done some, at least studied some aesthetics. I didn't realize this was a job interview. I was just feeling good, and so it went really well. And they hired me for a year, and then they hired me for a second year after that, and then they did a national search, and so I wound up teaching aesthetics as well as logic at the University of Tennessee. That was back in the late 70s and early 80s. Even though aesthetics was not really a specialty of mine in the academic sense. I've written a paper on it or two, but not much. But I wasn't at that time doing environmental stuff at all. And what changed for me to kind of get me into environmental, first activism and then environmental ethics and philosophy, was the birth of my first child, Jenna, my daughter, in 1985. And after she was born, I found myself strangely depressed. And I thought, well, geez, guys are not supposed to have postpartum depression. And I sat with that for a long while, and it finally came to me that I wasn't really depressed. I was angry, and I didn't have an outlet for my anger. And what my anger was about was the fact that my daughter was going to grow up into a world that was going to be less green and less beautiful and less safe than the world that I grew up in. And when I realized that, I thought, I've got to try to do something about this. And so starting in the 1980s, I began doing a lot of environmental activism outside of campus. I was moonlighting as an environmental activist for a number of years. And finally, that got to be such an obsession with me that I thought either I'm going to have to quit my tenure track job here at the University of Tennessee, or I'm going to have to find a way to integrate my environmental work with my academic work. And so I went to the chair of my department, George Brinkert at that time, said, George, I'd like to start an environmental ethics course. And he said, go ahead, do it. He was very supportive, and that really helped. And so I began teaching environmental ethics around 1990 and invited a lot of people from the community in who were active in various kinds of environmental issues, and had the students go out and do work in the community so that they could learn from the folks who were involved and who knew what things looked like from the ground up. And that was a very successful course, and I taught it for many years. In fact, all the way up until my retirement. And so that's how I came to teach environmental ethics. Actually, in the last 10 years, I've been working on something that's related, but not environmental ethics specifically, and that is I've gone back to my roots in logic and have been working on the concept of incomparable values. Two values are incomparable when neither is either greater than or less than or equal to the other. And this kind of arrangement happens all the time when we're comparing the value of things. This particularly shows up in environmental issues where you're dealing with such diverse values as the cost of a program, of biodiversity, and the effect on humanly desired projects and so on. They're all incomparable values. So you need some way to deal with those. And I have worked pretty hard last 10 years on trying to figure out how to best make decisions when the values involved in the decision making are incomparable. So I've written a book on that called Incomparable Values, and that was the most recent book that I've written. It was published just about a year ago. So that's sort of a quick summary of my academic path.
Yeah, what do you think you would have done if you had gone the other direction, if you had quit your job at the University of Tennessee and gone into something else, something environmentally related that was non-academic?
I would probably have worked. I would have tried to get a job at a non-governmental organization, and I knew a lot of people in that world, so I thought I had a chance of moving over there. But it wasn't clear to me exactly what I was doing. A lot of work on toxic wastes at the time, so possibly some kind of citizen group that had some funding, working on toxic wastes. Also, wetland destruction was an issue for me at that time. So I'm not sure what sort of group I would have moved into, although, but I just never got that far. Once I got the idea I could move some of this stuff, some of the work I was doing under the academic umbrella, that was good enough for me.
All right. Well, so environmental ethics for the long term is an introductory text, mostly aimed at undergraduates for an environmental ethics course. And in that book, you define environmental ethics as essentially the project of expanding our moral thinking in two different directions, beyond the human species and into not just the future, but the distant future, many generations down the line, hundreds of years down the line, potentially, maybe even millennia. And in some contexts, you might say even further, if we're talking about species extinctions or things like that. So part of that book is, as most introductory textbooks are, a survey of different theoretical approaches to various issues. So some of these are like traditional moral theories, like consequentialism, looking at outcomes of actions exclusively, deontology, looking at rules and principles, including non-consequentialist principles to make decisions, virtue ethics, where we look at individual moral character, and a bunch of other approaches to like relational ethics, contractualism, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of them. And then you also talk about different approaches to moral status, right? Where some people, anthropocentric approaches where it's all humans, right? It's just human beings matter morally, and that's it. And then a wide range of non-anthropocentric approaches that include non-human animals, all living organisms, ecosystems, possibly more stuff or different permutations of those things. So given all of that, I'm curious, and I imagine many of my students are curious, when you do your own environmental ethics work, what is the main combination of approaches that you use? Is it like, I'm guessing from the tenor of the book, it's not an anthropocentric approach, right?
That's right.
And I have some suspicions on the theoretical side too, but what is your favored approach to environmental ethics?
So as between the various approaches to ethics in general, I'm more or less a pluralist. I think they all have some legitimacy. But when you're doing things at a large scale, policy level scale, or when you're doing things on large time scales, I think the most reasonable ethics to adopt in those cases is consequentialist ethics. So I'm generally coming from a consequentialist perspective. I'm also coming from a long-term perspective in that I think that we have a responsibility for the consequences of our actions to the extent that they're predictable and knowable. And so, as you mentioned, one of the consequences of our actions is to cause species to go extinct. And that's a very long-term harm that cannot be remedied, at least by natural means, for timescales on the order of millions of years. So it takes maybe 10 million years. Once you drop the biodiversity to a certain level, it takes maybe 10 million years for a recovery. So I'm thinking of timeframes that long. I think for other things where you can get recovery quicker, you can have the results of your actions can be swamped by other events. You can be shorter term, but if we're talking about something on that scale, yes, we have to be thinking out that far. So it's a long-term ethic in that sense. It's also a biocentric ethic in that I believe not only should we be concerned morally about human beings and also about sentient beings, that is, those that are capable of some kind of experience, perhaps pleasurable, perhaps painful, but also even non-sentient beings, including all living things, plants, even microorganisms, insects, whatever. So my moral thinking extends to all those things. I'm a biocentrist.
So I want to ask a follow-up question then, based on what you said, actually in response to the first question when you're talking about your recent work on incomparable values. So if your orientation to environmental ethics generally is a consequentialist approach, and you've acknowledged there are lots of incomparable values, right?
Yes.
In environmental ethics, is the hope that there is a way to work out a consequentialist ethic incorporating, like for a consequentialist environmental ethic incorporating incomparable values, or
yes, yeah, that's exactly it. So in my book, I think it's not just a hope. I think I can prove it. The book contains over 300 theorems, and what it shows is that there are ways when you have, for example, you're trying to compare the welfare of a sentient being and a non-sentient being. The sentient being has an extra dimension of value, that dimension of experience that the non-sentient being doesn't have. So it's got a kind of value that the non-sentient being lacks. On the other hand, they're both living things. And so there's a kind of value in life itself, or we might assume that. I think it's true that there's a value just in life itself. We can talk more about that later, which is incomparable with the value in this other dimension, this value of experience. So then the question is, if you wanted to get a total picture, if you wanted to say, well, how do you aggregate these things? How do you make sense of trying to find out what's the best possible result for all of the creatures that you're trying to think about? This will include human beings, of course, in the end. You got a multi-dimensional array of different values, all of them in each dimension incomparable with the others. But it turns out there are ways of aggregating that sort of thing and comparing those sorts of things, not directly because you've got incomparable values, but indirectly because those values may be bounded by other values which are comparable. So the answer is it's fairly complex. It has a certain amount of technicality to it, but I'm quite convinced that it is possible to do consequentialist ethics using an array of incomparable values.
So it's been a while since I've looked at this literature, but to my recollection, the proposal that you're putting forward is something like two values A and B are incomparable, but there might be some other value C that we know they're both worse than or they're both better than.
That's right. That's the bounding notion. Yeah.
So we might not sure whether Michelangelo's sculpture is better than Mozart's symphony, but we know they're both better than some terrible generic pop song or something like that.
And anything that's worse than that pop song, they're better than that.
Right.
And there could also be something that's better than both, and so anything that's better than it is better than both. So that's the simplest way to get indirect comparison, is by those kinds of bounding relations. So there are others as well. But
the idea is that you'd have this it wouldn't be aesthetic examples, it would be like welfare comparisons.
Right. So that's what I'm interested in.
Among different organisms. And it would be like this giant network of these partial orderings.
That's right. It looks like a network is what the value structure looks like.
That sounds incredibly complex.
It can get complex, but the kinds of decisions making that we're doing all the time are incredibly complex and are often done with computers. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. If you're trying to do it on a large scale, it would have to be done on computers.
All right. Well, that's so super interesting. I want to look at a couple of specific kind of conclusions that you reach over the course of the reasoning in the book. There are two that I think are as close to consensus positions as we have in environmental ethics. One of them is we got to do something about climate change, like collectively. And that's a wide. Now there's some disagreement about exactly what we should do, what we should prioritize, and like who bears the responsibility to do it and that sort of thing. But as far as like collectively, we got to cut back on carbon emissions, transition to renewable energy, all work toward a more sustainable power production process. That seems like a substantial consensus position. And then the other one is we got to do something about industrial animal agriculture. We have to do. There are so many arguments against it, ranging from animal suffering to the treatment of the workers in those factories, to the long-term environmental unsustainability of it, local pollution. Like the list just goes on seemingly forever. Right. There are even health-related reasons why you don't want to be producing your meat that sort of way. So I take that to be a pretty strong consensus position as well. One of the things that's been interesting to me working in the field over the last decade is that there's a massive consensus on that. But when you ask the question of whether individual people are required to change their behavior, this is a much more divisive issue. There are some folks who think that an individual consumer or carbon emitter, or however you want to understand it, might be obligated to do things like vote for politicians who care about making reforms, or cooperate in a collective scheme of some kind that involves large-scale social change, but that you don't have any obligation to change your behavior in the absence of that kind of collective enterprise. Because, and the dominant argument now on that seems to be because what you do as an individual simply doesn't make a difference to the overall outcome. And there are various explanations that these folks will give as to why that happens. Some of it has to do with the economics of, say, you're just other factors swamp your individual decisions to purchase meat. Some people say that your individual carbon emissions are not appropriately causally connected to any kind of discernible harm that takes place down the line, and it's such an infinitesimal amount of the global emissions anyway. It's not going to, you're driving less or driving a more fuel efficient car doesn't doesn't change anything meaningful with respect to the overall outcome. So I was just kind of curious, what do you make of that line of argument, that general, like, I don't have an obligation to change my behavior because I'm just one person, it doesn't really make a difference? How would you respond to that thought?
Well, there are lots of different responses that one can give. One can give. One that a lot of people will say as well, but you need, if you're going to say that these things are causing problems, then you can't participate in these in buying commercially produced meat, for example, or in emitting fossil fuels without being a hypocrite. And that's an argument that a lot of people find persuasive. But I want to go directly to the core of it, and I've written actually quite a bit on the impact, the direct impact of an individual's carbon emissions on just human life over the next, let's say, 1,000 years. So if you emit, say, a lifetime carbon emission for an average American, that will add a certain amount of carbon to the atmosphere. Now, people say, well, there's no way to trace the causation. Well, you can't trace it in detail, but what we do know is that every additional increment of carbon, no matter how small, will add carbon atoms to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide atoms. Those carbon dioxide atoms will individually each absorb more of the radiated heat back from the Earth and contribute to the greenhouse effect. We can tell how much greenhouse gas will add what amount of temperature. Now that all gets kind of swamped out. Everything it's not the same level of temperature increase all over the world. We're talking about average temperature and so on. So you have to look at averages. But on the whole, you find that the individual contribution, particularly over a lifetime, say, of driving a car, is significant. I've tried to calculate it. On my calculation, it turned out to be something like the production of 1 or 2 casualties, where casualty means serious injury or death, per person, per lifetime carbon emission over the next 1,000 years. Now, those are very rough calculations. A lot of other people have done similar ones. Some of their estimates are less than mine. Some of their estimates are more than mine. But it's pretty clear that we do have a direct effect on global temperature each time we add carbon to the atmosphere, and that those things are causing harm. And if you say they're not causing any harm, it doesn't seem plausible, given that every additional increment of carbon dioxide increases the amount of harm. It just doesn't work. So I think those kinds of objections are completely wrong. Something similar, I think, is true. It's not quite the same argument with the animal ethics case. You're buying a piece of meat from the grocery store, may not have any discernible effect on the economic system. A lifetime of purchasing or not purchasing meat, depending on whether you make that decision, commercially produced meat from a grocery store, probably will have some effect, a small effect, but something, and you thereby also are not being a hypocrite by condemning the commercialization of agriculture in that way, and yet refraining from doing anything about it yourself.
It sounds like the move you want to make is something like, instead of focusing on individual one-off events, think of this more as a habit that you may or may not adopt over the course of your lifetime as a meat eater or a non-meat eater, or as a, and as an American who's in a very carbon intensive economy, and think more about what's going to happen over the course of your entire lifetime, your pattern of meat eating or emissions or whatever other environmentally relevant behavior it is. Think about it that way, rather than thinking about it in terms of just what you did on how much gas you put in your car on Tuesday, or how much meat you purchased on Wednesday. whatever.
Right. That's very difficult to trace, but a lifetime is traceable. Lifetime emission is traceable. Probably a lifetime purchase of meat too, though I haven't done those calculations.
It's an interesting response. So it sounds like you think that the traditional consequentialist argument can be defended, right?
Yes. Yeah.
You just got to make a different sort of move than most folks make. I will also mention for viewers, I'm gathering that the climate change stuff you're talking about is a reference to your paper, How Harmful Are the Average American's Greenhouse Gas Emissions?
Yeah, and then that's had a bunch of responses to it, and I've written some things later on it, but that was the original paper. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to dig it up and send a link for anybody who wants to check it out. I know that is that 2011 paper is one of your most widely cited papers.
Yeah, I think it is the most widely cited. It's even been cited in the New York Times.
Oh, all right. So another thing that I wanted to ask you about, your textbook was, I was looking at the copyright earlier, and at least the paperback version I've got is 2015. The last 5 years or so have seen a real upsurge in interest in population growth. Your textbook was a little bit ahead of the curve because you actually talk about population growth and talk about, the potential need to stabilize or reduce global population sooner rather than later, which at the time that you were writing this book was basically absent from all environmental ethics textbooks that I'm aware of, at least. That is an area where
people like Phil Cafaro and others were talking about it, but it wasn't in a textbook that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's my impression as well. So that's an area where the empirical projections have changed quite a bit the last 7 or 8 years, like in various ways. So in 2017, the UN, their medium fertility scenario projection, which they thought was most likely, they said 11.2 billion worldwide by the end of the century, by 2100. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's not even peak population. There was some uncertainty there. 2 years later, they revised it slightly downward to 10.9 billion in 2100. They just in the very end of 2022 came out with new projections, which say 10.4 billion people in 2100. But interestingly, a wider range of uncertainty on the outcome than their previous two medium fertility projections had. And there have been a couple of other groups, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation and the Center of the European and the Joint Research Center of the European Union. These two groups have produced estimates that are lower than what the UN says, and they project peak population earlier in the century than the UN does. I am not a demographer. I don't know which of these estimates is most accurate.
Nor am I. Yeah.
But it did get me thinking, what exactly, like what do you think we should be aiming for? Like, what should our goals be with respect to, global population this century? And if you had any thoughts about what the long-term sustainable number of people on the planet should be, like what we should aim for. I know there have been some recent folks who have tried to pin that number at something like 3 billion, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but around that number. And the idea there is not, it's not just how many people you can fit in the physical space of the planet, but it's like how many people could we have that are having a decent quality of life, meeting their basic needs, living in environmentally sustainable ways that also at some level respect the natural world and allow for the existence of wilderness, right? When we get to certain projections that the UN has run in their high fertility scenarios, like 14 or 15 billion people, there is no wilderness anymore, right? It's just people everywhere. Yeah. Everything is completely covered by housing or farmland or whatever, whatever else is needed for humanity to sustain itself. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that cluster of developments?
There are really two great problems that result in large part from the proliferation of human beings, the population growth. One of them we're already seeing in a big way, and that's climate change. The more people you got, the more human activities, the more carbon emissions. Now, there are ways of cutting that down, and we're trying very hard to reduce carbon emissions. Almost nobody's meeting the goals. So that's the first thing to note. We've got great goals. It is, at least in theory, possible to limit the temperature increase to something like 2 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Some people still cling to the 1.5 degrees target. I don't think that's even possible anymore, given the widespread inability to meet the carbon goals that people have set out for themselves. It's not happening. It's just not happening. So unless there's a miracle of some kind between now and 2050, or at least 2100, we're not even going to make the 2 degrees C goal. And what that means is that we're headed for some really, really awful climate change. The thing that's impressed me over the 30 years that I've been teaching environmental ethics is how accurate the climate predictions have been. We are now in a regime that, I was talking about 30 years ago. That's what it's going to be like, and that is what it's like. We see the intensified storms, we see droughts, we see wildfires, flooding, rising ocean levels, hurricanes of tremendous power all over the globe, melting ice caps. All this stuff was predicted 30 years ago. And the predictions are for much worse as we continue. So the only way, there are basically two variables leading to this problem. One is the population, the number of people on the planet. The second is the per capita carbon emissions. And we're not doing very well on getting the per capita carbon emissions down. So you've got the only other variable you got to work with is the number of people. We're not doing it very well on getting the number of people down either. Population growth is continuing globally, even though the projections for future population are that it are not as high as they once were. The growth is continuing. There are more and more people in the world every day. There are some places in the world where population growth has has stabilized and even gone down. So there are a few places in the world where the population is decreasing, but globally there are more and more and more people, more and more people with greater and greater carbon emissions. So I don't have a specific figure that I could tell you. I think the 3 billion is in the ballpark of what we could sustainably support from the point of view of carbon emissions. And then the second great problem I want to talk about here is we're about to induce a mass extinction if we don't change our ways. So mass extinction is a geologically short episode that takes place over less than 1 million years. In our case, it's going to take place much quicker, in which you lose 75% or more of the species on Earth. There have been 5 of them in the geological history of the Earth. The last one was when we had an asteroid hit the Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula, creating massive tidal waves and global fires and a nuclear winter. Wasn't nuclear, but blacked out the atmosphere. And that was what killed off the dinosaurs and much else of the life on Earth. That was the last time we lost 75% of the species on Earth. We're headed for that in the next 2 or 3 centuries if we don't get our destruction of land and the population growth under serious control. And the kind of Earth that would result from a mass extinction would be hellish. People, kind of want to picture, well, okay, we got people everywhere, and then there's farms, and that's all there is, and it'll be okay. It wouldn't be okay. There would be, first of all, you wouldn't have equitable distribution of the wealth, and that would create its own problems. There would be chaos. And there would be, wilderness has always served as a kind of safety valve for civilization. People situations become untenable and people move out into the wilderness. Without that safety valve, you're going to have a lot more violence. And so we're looking at a pretty horrible world unless we can get those numbers down. I think it's going to have to be something like 2 or 3 billion as a reasonable number. Now, how you do that without violence is a tall order. We have to look at those places where population is actually decreasing without violence, where people have decided that it just doesn't make sense to have as many children as we used to have. China is headed in that direction. Italy, I believe, has lower levels than replacement, and a few other places in the world, some of them where there is violence, and so there's not much hope in having children. But how you do it without violence is a big problem, but we would have to do it without violence.
Yeah, so this is actually like one of my main areas, right, is thinking about the ways we could reduce population permissibly. So I'll just note that a lot of developed countries, especially in Western Europe, have replacement rates, or excuse me, fertility rates well below replacement. And
Yes.
We know that creating better opportunities in society for women, giving them more educational opportunities, giving them more.
That's the number one.
Yeah, giving them
most effective thing.
Giving people easier access to contraception, improving sex education. We know that these are all nonviolent things that basically you just increase people's opportunities to take control of their reproductive lives. And in the case of gender justice for women, just give them opportunities to live lives that are not centrally connected to reproduction if that's what they want, right? Those things make a huge difference. And I'm also, my students will know this, I'll presented some of this material, but I'm also open, at least in theory, to certain kinds of media campaigns and educational campaigns, and maybe even a limited array of incentivization schemes, like say giving people financial, like a government rebate program or something. If you, I don't know, attend a family planning, seminar once a year and document it, or there have been some historical examples of doing things like paying people to get vasectomies or things like that. That's tied up with some socially insidious other policy dimensions. Like historically, that stuff's not always great because there were instances where the people who were being targeted for those kinds of incentives were people who were uneducated, had less wealth, etc. Like certain groups were being targeted, but not appropriate. That seems
racial
wrong.
Groups.
Yeah. So there's some that's more challenging, but I do think there are a lot of countries where the social conditions, the background social conditions that have been created clearly seem to result in below replacement fertility. And that does give some grounds, I think, for optimism about doing something along these
and
lines.
I think your work on that is incredibly valuable. It's really important that to explore the multitude of arrangements that could be made that would help with this problem.
Yeah, well, the work continues in a sense in this, because there's also, there are a lot of economists who want us to keep increasing population because of the perceived correlation between population growth and economic growth, and the background assumption being that economic growth is all that matters, or what matters most, or something like that. You have in your book a detailed critique of the preference utilitarian roots of neoclassical economics and some of the problems associated with that. And I don't want to belabor that point. I do want to ask you about a development outside of just environmental ethics recently, that ties into the sort of long-term angle of your book and the thinking expressed in the book. There have been some philosophers they label themselves long-termists.
Yeah.
And they essentially they're not just thinking long-term in terms of 10 generations out or 20 generations out or whatever. They're thinking long-term potentially in terms of millions or even billions of years. And most of these folks are consequentialists, and they look at the potential length of time that humanity could exist for. And they have come to the conclusion in some recent papers and a couple of books that the thing that we should be prioritizing is responding to what they call existential risk, which they mean the risk to humanity's existence, right? Threats of the extinction of the human species. And the reasoning behind this is that there could be trillions of people who are not yet born, right? Given if we live long enough, there could be trillions of people who are not yet born, and preventing even a really small risk that those trillions of people don't exist is of greater moral value in terms of like an expected value type consequentialist calculation than doing something that saves the lives of a lot of people currently living. And so the kinds of issues that these long-termist folks are really focused on is prioritizing the prevention of anything that threatens global extinction. Some of them are on the record as saying like, well, climate change isn't going to threaten human extinction, even if it's really bad. Yeah. And so we should be more concerned about a potential future asteroid impact, or runaway artificial intelligence, or stuff like that. And this is all to me, a lot of this stuff seems kind of weird and not. Yeah, like I'm sort of inclined to think like we got a lot of problems going on right now. I'm not sure if it makes sense to be thinking about what could hypothetically happen in, a million years, or in some cases like even longer timescales than that. As someone who's advocating for a brand of long-term thinking in this textbook, what do you make of this, and what would you say to this approach?
Yeah. So when I first heard of these long-termist guys, I having written a book called Environmental Ethics for the Long Term, I thought, oh, good, they're going to be doing stuff that'll be compatible with what I'm doing. And then when I read them, I was kind of horrified because they are betting on the existence of lives far into the future. William McCaskill, who's one of the leaders of this, talks about the hundreds of millions of years potential lifespan that humanity has potentially on the Earth, hundreds of millions of years left on the Earth, and then the tens of trillions of years left until the stars burn out, meaning that we could have space travel and to get to other planets. So then they say, well, okay, since there's some little tiny probability that there could be human beings for that length of time, we need to figure that into our calculations and focus on preventing human extinction rather than on other problems that we've got to deal with right now. Well, of course, I think everybody agrees we should prevent human extinction. Well, maybe not everybody, but I certainly agree. Who would not want to prevent human extinction, but to put huge amounts of resources toward things like preventing artificial intelligence from taking over the world when it's not anywhere close to doing that yet, or some of the other things that they talk about, preventing global thermonuclear war. Yes, we do want to prevent that, and we ought to put large resources into that, but not for the reason that there might be people 100 million years from now or trillions of years from now in space, but because of the effects on people right now. The problem is, the basic problem with all these extreme long-termist views is that they use expected value calculations, and expected value basically means, well, if this did happen, you get a certain amount of value. So you multiply that by the probability of that value happening, and then you get some figure that makes it look like that's a really valuable outcome. The problem is there's no way to estimate those probabilities with any kind of accuracy at all. We're completely ignorant of those probabilities. They'll take some kind of scenario and they'll say, well, even if the probability is, and they'll give a very, very low figure. Well, that low figure has no basis for it. There is no knowledge base behind that. It's just a guess. And for any low probability you could name, there are other possible low probabilities that are much, much lower, which would make the case go the other way. And since you don't have any good reason to distinguish between your low probability and the much lower probabilities, which would make it worthwhile to spend money on people 100 million years from now, it just the whole thing falls apart. It's based on sheer guesswork, and it doesn't impress me as something that we ought to be doing. We need to be looking at those things that we can control with some reasonable probability now. And of course, we want to prevent human extinction. Everybody's going to agree on that. We don't need to think about hundreds of millions of years from now in order to find good reasons to do that. So that far future is going to have to take care of itself. We just don't have enough knowledge to base any kind of expected utility calculation on the far future.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you would say we should be sensitive to considerations in the long term that we know about, or that we have actual evidence. So like your
and that we can affect.
Yeah, because your big long-term example in the book would be like species extinction, right?
Yeah.
And recovery could extend out for basically on the geological timescale, right? Literally millions of years to recover from that kind of biodiversity loss. But your argument is based on, well, we know mass extinction events occurred, and we can look at the fossil record and other things to basically deduce how long it takes to recover. Yeah. So we have some information here about what the impact really is going to be, and the events that are going to lead to the mass extinction are things that are probably going to happen in the next 200 or 300 years. But it's not about hypothetically postulating, well, suppose that an asteroid could hit us in the next 10 million years, and it's a one in a billion possibility, but it turns out it's actually like a 1 in quadrillion or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the thing is, a lot like consequentialists, most of them tend to be aware that we have very, very poor intuitions about large numbers, right?
Yeah.
And about how to like calculate probabilities and stuff like
that.
So
exactly right.
It's very weird to me that like they'd be doing guesswork like that in some of their stuff, or like hypothetical postulation of a low statistical number, because they know that their intuitions about that stuff are not reliable. Right? Yeah. A lot of them argue that, and maybe it's not the same people though, I don't know, but anyway. So I have I want to ask you just in general, you've had some time now to reflect on the book as a whole. Is there anything in it that you think you would add or change, or revise a little bit? Like if you were to write that book, like if you were drafting that book now in 2023, would there be anything you would do differently?
Yeah. One thing I would want to do is to be a good bit more explicit about where ethics comes from. I talked a lot about moral considerability in the book, and I spoke of it almost as if it were some kind of natural property or something. And I was following the literature doing that, but I think that gives the wrong impression. Here's what I do. I'd be more explicit about the fact that ethics in general are humanly constructed, that we not just a certain group of people, but people collectively, primarily through moral leaders, but also through academic institutions and so on, we develop ideas of what is right and put those into practice to deal with the particular predicaments that we have at a given time. Ethics has developed over time. It's evolved over time. And there's a long story in the history of ethics that can be told there. The fact is that now our current predicament, the current situation that we find ourselves in which we need to construct the ethics that will enable us to go on, is that we're the most destructive species on Earth. We're doing tremendous damage to just about, well, not there's some life forms that are compatible with us, but most of the life forms on Earth, we're doing tremendous destruction to them. We're making the future less and less livable as we change the climate. And so the fundamental moral problem for humanity at this juncture in our history is, how can we become less destructive? And so the ethics that we need to evolve, and evolve quickly, is an ethics of non-destructiveness, for want of a better word. It's an ungainly word, but that's what it is. How can we become less destructive? And that, then, I would argue, as the basis for taking on a biocentric ethic. I think I'd be less generous maybe to some of the other views, and say, look, we really, at this point, it is crucial for us to adopt a biocentric ethic. We're going to have a mass extinction, and the results of that will be catastrophic. So I think that's the way I'd go with the book if I were to revise it.
Okay, so bringing together a few thoughts here. I have, like, this is my sort of closing question, because this is something I worry about my students in a course like this. It's very easy to study environmental ethics and get a bit depressed about the current state of things, about the projections for the future, about the progress or lack of progress that's been made on a lot of issues. You mentioned you don't think it's even feasible to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal.
Right.
And that it's extraordinarily unlikely to meet the 2 degrees Celsius goal. You've mentioned the prospects of mass extinction event over the next 2 to 3 centuries.
2 to 3 centuries, yeah,
give or take. And my students are the people who currently live, right, who will be most affected by what happens later this century, who are going to see, they will see, assuming basic figures about life expectancy and so on, they will see significantly more of this than you or I do.
Right.
So I guess I would just wonder, like, I imagine and put myself in the headspace of some of my students, and I think, man, things just look really hopeless. How do you what would you say to a student in this kind of position? Like, how can we respond to this information in a way that's not just despair, basically?
Yeah. So hope, I think, lies in self-transcendence. And what that means is that as long as you care about nothing but yourself, you're going to die in some decades, and the closer you get to that point where you're going to die, the less hope you have, because the less life you have, and so caring for nothing but yourself is in the end hopeless. You can resort to hope in some otherworldly beings or religious beliefs of some kind. Those are becoming less and less difficult, less and less easy to sustain in a society like American society currently, in which the number of religious people is shrinking pretty rapidly. And maybe that's a way to be hopeful, if you want to be hopeful in hoping for some otherworldly life or some otherworldly reality. But there remains the probability or the possibility that you might be wrong, and maybe that will become apparent to you at some point. So then, what else can you be self-transcendent toward? Well, you can be self-transcendent toward other people. You can love your children. You can love your grandchildren if you have children and grandchildren. So there's some self-transcendence there, but it gets you only a few generations down the line. If you love life, now you got something where you can have hope for it, for a very long time. And you might think, well, that sounds ridiculous. You're talking about mass extinction. You're talking about all this stuff. What that overlooks is the tremendous resilience of life itself. Life has recovered from 5 mass extinctions already. Each time it has recovered from a mass extinction, it has come back more biodiverse and more complex than before. So if you are self-transcendent toward living things, even if we're headed into another mass extinction, there will be a recovery from that mass extinction. It's not that people talk about, we're trying to protect the planet. We're don't destroy the planet. Don't destroy the all. It's not going to happen. Life is incredibly tenacious. And the real hope to me lies in working toward the promotion and recovery of life itself. Not even the human species, although I want to see the human species continue and do better than it's been doing. That is, be better kinds of individuals than we are. But there is tremendous long-term hope in life itself. Not forever. Life's not going to live forever on Earth. It will eventually be gone when the sun burns out, or even before that, when it becomes a red giant star. But that's hundreds and hundreds of millions of years down the line, and there's probably life on other planets as well. So life will continue, and that's where I think our hope lies.
All right, John. Well, that is right at an hour for us, and that's actually longer than I intended to take up your time today, as it is. But thank you so much for answering my questions. I hope that the students will benefit from this information as much as I have. Anything else you want to say or add before we sign off?
Well, thank you for your work and your teaching. You're doing great things, and I hope you'll continue. And if any of your students, have issues that they would like to talk with me about, tell them to send me an email. I'll respond.
All right, I'll pass that on to them. Thanks, John. It's been fun. I got to get lunch. I imagine you have things to do as well. So
Good to see you, Peter.
Yeah. So maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be good.
All right. See you.
Bye.